The rain was relentless, a curtain of water hammering the windshield, smearing the glow of streetlights into watery halos. Grace gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white under the dim dashboard light. Every few seconds, the wipers cut across the glass with a harsh screech, offering a moment's clarity before everything blurred again. Her eyes burned, not just from exhaustion, but from the tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed. Not yet. The storm outside felt eerily like the storm within her, chaotic, suffocating, and inescapable. It had been 6 months since Daniel died. 6 months since the call, the silence, the funeral, the emptiness. Now she drove with no destination, just trying to breathe, to feel something again. Lightning split the sky, and for a second, everything stopped. Then thunder crashed so loud it seemed to shake her bones. She flinched, but didn't slow down. She couldn't slow down, not tonight. Each flicker of the streetlight seemed like a heartbeat echoing her pain. Daniel used to joke that the world dimmed when she wasn't smiling, and now the world felt permanently dark. Her wedding ring still sat on the chain around her neck, heavy and cold against her skin. The rhythm of the wipers became a metronome to memory. Their weekend hikes, Sunday breakfasts, his laugh echoing down the hallway, gone. She couldn't stop the flashbacks no matter how fast she drove. She hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Grief had wrapped her in silence. Until tonight. Until that sound. A flash of movement. A shadow cutting across her headlights. Grace gasped and slammed the brakes. Tires screamed against wet asphalt, the car fishtailing before lurching to a stop just inches from the shape. Her heart pounded violently in her chest as she sat frozen, breath caught in her throat. Outside, in the middle of the road, stood a large, drenched dog, a German shepherd. His coat was soaked to the skin, fur clinging to his frame. Water dripped from his snout as he turned toward the headlights, eyes reflecting not fear, but urgency. Grace leaned forward, still shaking from the near collision. Her hands trembled as she reached for the hazard lights, pulse racing. The shepherd hadn't run, hadn't flinched. He had jumped in front of her car, as if on purpose. Instead of fleeing, the dog barked. Not wildly, not aggressively, but with purpose. 3 short, sharp barks. He stood his ground in the pouring rain, unwavering. The wind howled around them, but the shepherd didn't budge. His eyes never left hers. Deep, soulful, filled with something too human to name. The cold night pressed in, but Grace couldn't tear her gaze away. It wasn't just a dog on the road, it was a messenger, a guardian, a desperate soul with something to show. She could feel it in her gut. Something was wrong. Grace blinked, trying to shake off the lingering adrenaline. But the longer she stared, the more certain she became. This dog wasn't scared. He wasn't hurt. He wasn't even looking for help for himself. He was asking for hers. There was urgency in his stance, in his eyes. She'd seen that look before, in Daniel's eyes during his last moments, reaching for her hand, not for comfort, but to give her strength. That same desperation now stared at her through the rain. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a plea, a silent, thunderous cry for her to follow. Without thinking, Grace shoved the car door open. Rain slammed into her like a wall, cold, punishing, and sharp, but she barely noticed. Her boots splashed into puddles as she stepped out, slow and cautious. The shepherd backed up a few paces, then barked again, looking over his shoulder toward the alley ahead. He wanted her to come. Grace hesitated. Common sense screamed to stay in the car, but something deeper, something wounded and wordless, pushed her forward. She didn't know why, she didn't know where, but she knew she had to follow. As Grace took that first step toward the dog, the world seemed to quiet. The rain still fell, the wind still howled, but inside her, a shift had begun. The storm had brought her to the edge of something new. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to begin again. Rain slammed against the porch roof like a war drum. Grace stood frozen, her sweater damp from the open door behind her. The German shepherd stood in the deluge, soaked to the bone, fur matted and tail low. But it wasn't fear in the animal's eyes, it was desperation. Then it happened. The dog lunged forward and barked sharply, yanking at her sleeve with its teeth, not with violence but with urgency. Grace stumbled back a step, breath catching. "What?" she whispered, heart pounding. The dog released her, circled, then barked again, short, frantic bursts. Grace's numb haze, her quiet surrender to a life half-lived, cracked in that instant. She hadn't felt this jolt of adrenaline since the accident. And then came the image. She blinked, and suddenly she was there again, the dashboard lights flickering, metal crunching. Her husband's hand slipping from hers, his voice ragged, gasping. "Grace, just hold on." She'd held on, but he hadn't. The sirens, the shouting, the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. It all came roaring back like it had just happened. The wreckage, the shattered glass, the little girl in the back seat they couldn't save. She'd been the best in her EMT unit. Calm under pressure, surgical with her hands, until that night stole everything. She stepped back from the door, one hand to her temple. Not again. I can't do this again. But the dog didn't care about her ghosts. It barked again, louder this time, then took off across the driveway, pausing only to make sure she was watching. And somehow, she was already following. The storm lashed at her face as she grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the night, her shoes sinking into the wet earth. The shepherd stopped at the tree line, turned back, and met her eyes with such human urgency it made her chest ache. "Where are you taking me?" she muttered, voice cracking. Another bark, another step deeper into the woods. She shouldn't be doing this. She hadn't touched a medical bag in nearly 2 years, but some part of her, the part that hadn't died with him, felt pulled forward by invisible threads of instinct. And the dog wouldn't give up. Branches slapped at her arms. Mud clung to her jeans. The flashlight trembled in her grip. The German shepherd moved with impossible certainty, weaving through brush and over slick stones, never looking back but never too far ahead. Grace pushed forward, her breath shallow. Every sound echoed, the snap of a twig, the wind howling like voices in the trees. Doubt gnawed at her. Was this real? Had she finally cracked under grief? And yet, every step felt like a test of faith. The dog barked again, this time sharper, urgent. It picked up speed. Grace nearly slipped down a slope, catching herself on a root. She steadied, heart hammering. She wasn't chasing shadows. Something real waited in the dark. The beam of her flashlight hit something metallic, something unnatural in the woods. She froze. There, down a shallow incline, was the glint of crumpled steel. A car. Flipped on its side, nose crushed into the dirt, the rear end draped in a blanket of wet leaves. She scrambled down the slope, slipping once, the dog bounding ahead. The license plate was caked in mud. One back wheel spun slowly in the breeze, creaking. "No way anyone saw this from the road," she whispered. The windshield was cracked but intact. She inched forward, peering through the glass. Movement. Or was it? The dog pawed at the back door, barking again, piercing, panicked. Grace's breath hitched. There was someone inside. She angled her flashlight inside, and her heart stopped. A girl, no older than 5, head slumped to the side, strapped in tight, blonde curls matted with rainwater, face pale, lips tinged slightly blue. God, Grace whispered. The memory hit her like a punch. Another girl, another crash, another time she was too late. Not this time. She dropped to her knees, tried the door. It wouldn't budge. She circled to the other side where the window had shattered. Careful of the glass, she reached in and touched the child's neck. A pulse. Faint, but there. She let out a trembling breath. Okay, sweetheart, hang on. The dog stood beside her now, silent and still, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. This dog had brought her here, had saved this child. And now, it was Grace's turn to do the same. Her fingers trembled, slick with rain. She pulled out her phone, hands barely steady enough to tap the screen. 911. Yes, I have a child, unconscious, car accident, woods off Route 9, maybe half a mile in. Send help, now. Her voice snapped back into control, short, clear bursts, like she used to teach the rookies. She wrapped her sweater and scarf around the girl to keep her warm, checked for signs of head trauma, and kept talking softly. You're okay, little one. You're safe now. Just keep breathing. The shepherd sat beside her, panting, watching her work with those same knowing eyes. For the first time in years, Grace wasn't haunted by what she'd lost. She was present. She was needed. And as the distant sound of sirens pierced the night, she whispered, "You found her. You saved her." The dog wagged its tail. The morning air was bitter, carrying the sting of frost that crept beneath the doorframe. Grace rubbed the sleep from her eyes and shuffled toward the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered outside. There, curled tightly on the porch like a discarded shadow, was the dog. The same one she had seen the night before, just for a second, on the edge of the woods. He wasn't just passing through. He had chosen her porch as a sanctuary. His eyes fluttered open as if he sensed her watching. Quiet, still, waiting. She opened the door slowly. The dog didn't flinch. His coat was matted. His ribs showed faintly beneath the fur, but his gaze held no fear, just hope, as if he had made the decision for both of them. And Grace, for reasons she couldn't name, didn't ask him to leave. Grace called animal control that afternoon. They told her they'd begin searching for the owner, that they'd keep her updated. In the meantime, she could keep the dog if she wanted, temporarily. She left out water and food. He ate quietly, respectfully, like he knew this wasn't his home, like he didn't want to overstay. She started calling him Shadow because he barely made a sound. He followed her at a distance, never intruding, never barking. He sat beside the couch when she read, by the door when she cooked, always present but never imposing. Her routines, once hollow with silence, now had rhythm, a shape moving at the edge of her world, subtly filling the gaps. He never asked to be held. He never asked to be loved. But in his presence, her loneliness softened, quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first thaw after winter. It wasn't long before Shadow stopped pretending he didn't care. At first, it was just the living room, then the hallway. Then the bathroom door cracked open and Grace noticed a familiar nose nudge its way in. He never pushed boundaries, never forced himself in. But wherever she was, there he was too, watching, waiting, breathing when she breathed. She laughed the first time she realized he followed her from room to room. "You're really taking this shadow thing seriously, huh?" she murmured, scratching behind his ear. His tail wagged once. That was enough. Grace hadn't talked to anyone in days, but with Shadow, she didn't have to fill the silence. He filled it for her, with presence, with patience. The scream woke her before she realized it was hers. Grace sat up in bed, chest heaving, sweat soaking through the sheets. The shadows on the walls twisted. She couldn't breathe. The room felt too small. Then she felt it, a soft weight on her chest. Shadow's paw. He didn't bark, he didn't move. He just pressed that paw gently against her ribs, grounding her like an anchor in a storm. His eyes were locked on hers. No panic, just quiet assurance. Her breathing slowed, her hands trembled, but she reached up and wrapped her fingers around his paw. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, boy, I'm here." But deep down, she knew. It was he who was here for her. Grace hadn't touched her EMT gear in months. Not since the accident. Not since the long, awful stretch of blank days where every step felt like a lie. But Shadow changed something. On her worst mornings when getting out of bed felt impossible, his cold nose nudged under her palm. Sometimes he'd drop her old boot beside her bed, tail wagging like a soft nudge from the past. She began practicing old drills again, splinting, assessing vitals, wrapping bandages around pillows. Shadow would sit nearby, eyes tracking her movements like a second pair of lungs, helping her breathe through it. They were both healing. Her from trauma. Him from abandonment. Neither fast, neither as perfect. But together, they moved. The vet was kind, gentle even, but her expression tightened as she ran her hands over Shadow's frail frame. "He's been through a lot," she said quietly. Grace swallowed hard. She already suspected, but hearing the words felt like swallowing glass. Malnourished, dehydrated, scar tissue along the ribs, probably chained at some point. Maybe left in the cold. Shadow sat obediently, panting softly. "He trusts you," the vet added. "That's rare, after everything." Grace reached for his leash, and as they walked out she blinked back the tears. She had taken him in, thinking she was the rescuer. But this dog, this quiet survivor. He carried stories deeper than she ever guessed. The sky split open that evening, thunder rolling across the hills like a drum of war. Grace was in the kitchen when she noticed Shadow was missing. She searched the house calling gently. No answer. Then she heard it, the faintest whimper from the closet in her bedroom. She opened the door slowly and found him curled in the corner, trembling uncontrollably, his eyes wide with terror. Grace dropped to her knees without hesitation. She crawled inside, wrapped her arms around him, and began whispering. "It's okay. You're safe. I've got you." His heartbeat thudded against her arm like a wild bird trapped in a cage. She just held him, the same way he had held her when she couldn't breathe. That night she didn't move from the floor. Neither did Shadow. As the storm subsided outside, the silence inside became something sacred. His head slowly lowered into her lap, breath evening out, the trembles subsiding. And in that fragile moment, Grace realized something monumental. This wasn't just a rescue. This wasn't pity or caretaking or temporary shelter. This was survival. Shared. Two broken beings finding wholeness not in isolation, but in each other's presence. She stroked behind his ear and whispered, "I don't know who hurt you, boy, but I'm not letting it happen again." And for the first time in weeks, she slept deeply. The knock came mid-morning. Grace opened the door to a uniformed officer holding a clipboard. "Just a follow-up," he said. "We haven't found any reported owners. Protocol says we'll transfer him to the shelter within the week." She nodded mechanically. "Okay, thank you." The door closed with a thud that echoed louder than the thunderstorm days before. Shadow padded over, pressing his body into her leg. Grace bent down, burying her face in his fur. "It's not fair," she whispered. You just got here." Shadow didn't understand words, but he understood the sadness in her voice, and he stayed. She didn't talk about it. Not to the vet, not to animal control, not even to herself. But the idea of Shadow leaving, it felt like someone reaching into her chest and pulling threads loose. Every moment now felt heavier, when he followed her down the hallway, when he curled by her feet at night, when his eyes met hers with that silent knowing. She tried to convince herself it was silly. He was a stray. This was always temporary. But her heart had already decided he wasn't temporary, he was home. And losing him now, that would break something that had just started to heal. Grace sat at the kitchen table, holding Shadow's microchip scanner, her fingers trembling as she read the code on the screen. She wasn't prepared for the revelation that followed. The numbers, just a string of digits to most, told a story far darker than she could have imagined. The microchip beeped, and the results flashed up on the screen. Shadow had once been a search and rescue dog. His identification led to a series of images and notes from his time on the field, his eyes wide and intense in each photo. But there was one image in particular, a grim picture of a muddy hillside, debris scattered everywhere. Her heart dropped as the text read, "Mission failed. Missing child presumed lost." Grace swallowed hard, trying to push the wave of emotion that washed over her. Shadow, her loyal, gentle companion, had been through unimaginable trauma. A failure in his past that still haunted him. Grace's thoughts spun as the pieces of Shadow's past began to fall into place. A failed rescue mission. A mission that had cost the life of a young girl. The image in her mind was sharp. Shadow, once a proud working dog, had seen his world crumble when he couldn't save the girl from a deadly landslide. The failure had devastated him, and by the time he was retired, it seemed as though his spirit had been broken. She knew then, with painful clarity, why he carried such sorrow in his eyes, why he recoiled at certain sounds, why his body still shivered when reminded of the trauma he had faced. But how could she fix this? How could she erase the pain he carried in his heart? The phone rang late one evening, the sound of it slicing through the quiet of her home. Grace picked it up without thinking, and the voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "Miss Thompson, this is Officer Keller from the Search and Rescue Division. We need to talk about Shadow." Her stomach churned. She knew what was coming, but she wasn't ready. Keller went on to explain that the government agency overseeing retired service dogs had reviewed Shadow's records. His previous failures had not gone unnoticed, and they were requesting his return for reevaluation. Grace's heart sank. If he's deemed unfit for further service, we'll have to euthanize him. Grace's grip on the phone tightened, her chest tightening with the weight of those words. She felt the tears threatening to fall, but fought them back. She couldn't lose him. Not after everything they had been through. The decision weighed heavily on Grace's heart. The idea of losing Shadow to euthanasia or being forced to give him up for reevaluation was unthinkable. Yet the system demanded it. The agency was clear. Shadow was a risk. He could never be trusted again to work with people. But how could she abandon the dog who had been her lifeline, the one who had healed her own wounds with his unwavering presence? She had to make a choice. Follow the agency's order and risk losing him forever, or defy the system and fight for the dog who had saved her more times than she could count. Her heart screamed for the latter. Shadow had earned his second chance. He deserved it, and she wasn't going to let them take that away from him. That night, after a long, emotional discussion with her family, Grace went out for a walk with Shadow. They wandered through the woods, the air crisp and full of promise. But when Grace turned to speak to him, she realized he was gone. Panic surged through her. Shadow had bolted without warning, his powerful legs carrying him into the darkness. She called out, but he didn't return. Her mind raced with confusion, guilt, and fear. Had she done something wrong? Was this his way of rejecting her, of running away from the painful past? Her legs grew weak as she staggered forward, praying to find him, to feel his warm presence beside her once again. Hours passed, and Grace was on the verge of giving up when she reached a familiar place, the old crash site. It was where they had first met, where Shadow had saved her life all those months ago. She stood still, listening for the slightest sound, her heart beating wildly in her chest. And then she heard it, a bark. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. Grace rushed toward the sound, her feet carrying her faster than she thought possible. When she reached the site, she froze. There was Shadow, standing stock still, his eyes locked onto something in the distance. A broken-down car. A child trapped inside. Shadow stood like a sentinel, barking urgently, his gaze locked on the car. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Shadow's past, the trauma, the failure, was forgotten in this moment. He wasn't a broken dog, he was a hero, a protector, doing what he was trained to do. She watched as Shadow circled the car, his movements sharp, precise, his nose pressed to the ground, and then, without hesitation, he pointed to a spot just behind the vehicle. Grace's heart surged as she realized what he was trying to tell her. The child was trapped beneath it. Grace knew what had to be done. She called 911, her voice shaking as she described the scene. But as she waited, Shadow refused to leave, his presence unyielding. He stayed by the car, barking, urging her to act. Emergency services arrived within minutes, and together, Grace and Shadow worked to guide them to the exact location of the child. The rescue was flawless. No hesitation, no second guessing. Shadow's instincts were sharp, and his failure from the past was nothing but a shadow in the distance. This time, they didn't fail. As the child was carried to safety, Grace wrapped her arms around Shadow, unable to hold back the tears. The weight of their journey together, the struggles they had faced, the wounds they had healed, it all seemed to culminate in this moment. Trembling, she held him close, whispering words of gratitude and love. He had not failed her. They had saved someone together. And in that moment, Grace knew the bond they shared was unbreakable. "You're more than just a dog," she whispered. "You're my hero." Shadow leaned into her, his body warm against hers, a silent acknowledgement that they had both survived. Together. It had been weeks since Shadow's heroic act. The day the headline blared across the local news felt surreal to Grace. The local newspaper had covered the story of the rescue. Former search and rescue dog saves child in life or death moment. And it had spread like wildfire across the community. The small town, once quiet and unassuming, buzzed with admiration for the dog who had defied his own past to save a life. Grace sat at her kitchen table, the paper in front of her, eyes lingering on the photo of Shadow, proudly sitting by her side, his expression calm, but his eyes filled with the weight of everything he had endured. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she reread the words, her fingers tracing the edge of the page. It wasn't just about Shadow. It was about the bond they had forged, the healing they had both experienced, and the future they would share together. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. As she answered, the voice on the other end trembled with emotion. "Grace, we just wanted to let you know. This story has touched so many of us. Thank you. You and Shadow are heroes. Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she looked down at Shadow, his gentle eyes meeting hers. He had given her more than she could ever repay. A soft knock on the door startled Grace as she prepared dinner. She opened it to find the parents of the young girl Shadow had saved standing in front of her, their faces overwhelmed with emotion. We just wanted to come by," the father said, his voice cracking, "to thank you and Shadow. We'll never forget what he did for our daughter." Before Grace could respond, the mother stepped forward, pulling her into a tight embrace. The gratitude, the weight of the moment, was almost more than Grace could bear. She squeezed back, feeling the warmth of their hug, the shared bond of love and relief. Shadow stood by her side, his tail wagging, as if he understood the depth of this moment. He'd always been the one who saved, but now, in this quiet home, he was being saved too. The parents stepped back, eyes misty. "We wanted to give this to you," the father said, holding out a small, framed photo of their daughter with Shadow, a thank you card taped to the back. Grace accepted it silently, tears falling freely now. She had never imagined how deep this bond with Shadow would run. Grace sat at her desk, the official paperwork in front of her. She had never thought this moment would come, never imagined how deeply she would feel this change. With a deep breath, she signed the papers. Shadow was no longer just a rescue dog. He was now her family, legally and in her heart. As the ink dried, Grace looked at him, her heart swelling with pride. Shadow had come from a past filled with failure and loss, but now he was home. He was with her, and nothing would ever change that. He rested his head on her lap, a soft whine escaping his throat, as if to say, "We did it." Inspired by Shadow's transformation, Grace knew she couldn't stop here. She needed to give back, needed to help others experience the healing she had found. And so, she began volunteering at a local rescue training center where dogs like Shadow were rehabilitated, trained, and given a second chance at life. She worked alongside the trainers, helping the dogs learn new skills, just as Shadow had once been taught. But it wasn't just the dogs who were healing. As she witnessed the transformation of each dog, she saw pieces of herself being put back together. Shadow would often sit by her side during her shifts, a calm presence in the chaos of the rescue center, his once turbulent past now fueling his desire to help others. Together, they had found their purpose, not just in surviving but in thriving, in giving. Grace's past had always haunted her, the loss of her family, the brokenness of her own heart. But with Shadow by her side, she was learning to face those demons head on. Her work at the rescue center, her connection with Shadow, had become the foundation of a new life, one that was not defined by loss, but by the strength they had built together. She no longer hid from the memories of her past. Instead, they drove her to help others, people and animals alike. She could look in the mirror now and see someone strong, someone who had learned to heal. And in Shadow's eyes, she saw the same thing. A dog who had overcome his own trauma to become a source of strength. Together, they were no longer broken. They were brave. A few months later, Grace and Shadow found themselves sitting on the same roadside bench where their journey had begun. The world around them had changed, and so had they. No longer was the bench a symbol of uncertainty. Now, it stood as a reminder of their growth, of everything they had faced together. They sat quietly, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow on the grass around them. Shadow lay at her feet, content and peaceful. Grace looked at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "We did it, didn't we, boy?" she whispered, her fingers gently stroking his fur. He responded with a soft nudge of his nose against her hand, as if to say, "Yes, we did." At that moment, Grace knew that this was just the beginning. They would face whatever came next together, side by side. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Shadow lay at Grace's feet, his head resting gently on her hand. The touch was simple, but it held everything they had been through, everything they had healed from, and everything they had given to one another. Grace ran her fingers through his fur, her heart full. They had saved each other, and in that quiet moment she realized that the bond between them was unbreakable. They had both been broken, but together they had become whole. Shadow's eyes closed, his breath steady and calm. Grace smiled, knowing that no matter what life had in store, they would face it together. And in that silent, shared moment, they both knew that the touch of love had healed two souls, one human, one dog, and their journey had only just begun. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the landscape, Grace sat on the porch, her hands gently resting on the warm, furry head of Shadow. His deep brown eyes met hers with a quiet intensity, as if they shared an unspoken understanding. She had saved him, yes, but over the weeks she had come to realize that the bond they'd formed had done far more than heal him. Shadow had saved her too. His loyalty, his patience, and his unwavering presence had slowly mended the broken pieces of her soul. Where there had once been a heart closed off by grief, there was now a tender space full of love and trust. In Shadow's eyes, Grace saw a reflection of her own strength, and it hit her. This dog, who had once been abandoned, had become the cornerstone of her new life. Shadow had been scarred, physically and emotionally. Yet, in his silence, he carried a resilience that was almost palpable. Grace knew, from the way he had stood by her through dark nights and difficult moments, that his past had forged something unbreakable inside him. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a healer. The story of his survival wasn't one of fear, but of strength. His battered heart had somehow learned to trust again, and that trust had opened the door to healing for both of them. Shadow had taken Grace's broken pieces and helped her rebuild them, just as he had rebuilt himself. Grace had spent years trying to outrun her pain, but it wasn't until she accepted it that she found healing. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the hurt didn't exist. Healing, Grace realized, was about moving forward, side by side with someone who understood the weight of it. Shadow had never judged her scars. Instead, he had walked beside her through the worst of them, a constant reminder that true healing came not from forgetting, but from sharing the journey with someone who offered both solace and understanding. With Shadow, Grace felt less like a victim of her own past, and more like someone ready to face the future. One quiet evening, as Grace lay on the couch, she felt the familiar weight of Shadow's paws resting on her chest. She closed her eyes, feeling the steady rhythm of his breath mingling with her own. In that moment, it wasn't just the comfort of his presence that mattered, but the silent promise he gave her every day that no matter what they had both endured, they had each other. Shadow's eyes, filled with unconditional love and trust, were a reminder that sometimes a second chance at life wasn't just given. It was earned through small, everyday acts of connection. Grace knew, with absolute certainty, that she was never truly alone. It had all started with a chance encounter, a roadside rescue that neither Grace nor Shadow had expected. But in that fateful moment, destiny had intervened. What began as a desperate act to save a dog in need had blossomed into something far greater than either could have imagined. They had been two broken souls, lost and alone, carrying burdens that seemed too heavy to bear. But together they had found healing, strength, and most of all, love. In the end, it wasn't just a rescue, it was a lifelong bond that had saved them both. Love had found them when they were at their lowest, and it had transformed them into something more than they had ever hoped to be, complete.